The silence has been broken. For more than 60 years, Burkina Faso stood apart on the map of Africa. A land where the law said nothing about same-sex relations, where the absence of punishment gave an unusual neutrality in a continent marked by colonial codes and prohibitions. But in September 2025, that silence ended. In a unanimous vote, the Transitional Parliament of Ouagadougou criminalized homosexuality, prescribing prison, fines, and expulsion for foreigners. It was not just a change in the legal text. It was a declaration. Was this about morality? Was it about family values? Or was it about sovereignty? A continent refusing to be told by outsiders what to believe and how to live. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young soldier who became head of state after a coup, presented the law as more than legislation. It was a statement of independence, a rejection of foreign tutelage, a seed of defiance planted in Sahelian soil. Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read the future of Africa. Stay with us and subscribe to walk with this story. Burkina Faso was never meant to stand at the center of this storm. For decades, it lived in an unusual silence. Unlike Uganda, Nigeria, or Ghana, it inherited no British colonial laws that criminalized same-sex relations. Unlike many of its francophone neighbors, it never introduced prohibitions in its own penal code after independence in 1960. The result was striking. On paper, Burkina Faso was one of the rare African nations where homosexuality was not a crime. But neutrality is not the same as freedom. The streets of Ouagadougou were never filled with rainbow flags. In villages and towns, in mosques and churches, conservatism shaped the rhythm of life. Religion and tradition kept homosexuality taboo, discussed only in whispers and condemned in private. What distinguished Burkina Faso was not acceptance, but the absence of a written ban. For over 60 years, this silence stood as a fragile buffer, a space where the state looked away. The buffer began to crack in 2024. The transitional government, facing war in the Sahel and pressure at home, introduced a draft amendment to the family code. For the first time, the word homosexuality appeared in legal language. It was not an accident. Across Africa, a wave was rising. Uganda had shocked the world with its Anti-Homosexuality Act, prescribing death sentences for aggravated cases. In Mali, a junta government criminalized same-sex relations. In Ghana, debates in parliament gained momentum. Nigeria enforced its restrictions with police raids. What had once seemed an anomaly, Burkina Faso's silence, was quickly becoming a deviation from the continental pattern. September 2025 marked the turning point. In Ouagadougou, the transitional parliament gathered for a historic vote. There was no debate, no dissenting voice. Every hand was raised in favor. The law passed unanimously. Its provisions were clear: 2 to 5 years in prison, financial fines, and deportation for foreigners. Overnight, what had been tolerated in silence became punishable by law. Justice Minister Edasso Rodrigue Baya defended the move in stark terms. He called homosexuality bizarre behavior, a phrase that resonated with a deeply religious nation where over 90% of citizens identify with a faith. His words echoed sermons preached in churches, verses recited in mosques, and conversations whispered at family tables. The law, in this sense, was less a rupture than a codification of sentiments long present in society. Yet the significance went further. By erasing neutrality, Burkina Faso signaled that it was no longer willing to leave its identity unspoken. This was a choice to align legal frameworks with cultural instincts, to transform silence into proclamation. It was also a declaration that Burkina Faso would not remain an exception in the Sahel. Instead, it would join a continental chorus, one that saw sovereignty expressed not only through borders and armies, but also through the regulation of morality. The vote of September 2025 will be remembered not for the punishment it prescribed, but for the symbolism it carried. It was a moment when a nation drew a line between its values and the expectations of the outside world, a line between being judged by foreign metrics and being governed by local consensus. But symbolism cuts both ways. For every citizen who saw dignity in the law, there were voices abroad who condemned it as regression. International headlines framed Burkina Faso as a new chapter in Africa's backlash against liberal norms. Rights groups warned of consequences. Development partners whispered about sanctions. In the heart of Ouagadougou, however, the message was clear. We decide. And that message carried the weight of history, of a people who had endured colonial intrusion and foreign lectures for generations. The law was not just about who could love whom. It was about who had the right to write the rules. And yet, behind the unanimous vote, another story was waiting to unfold, one that stretched beyond morality into the raw politics of survival. The chamber in Ouagadougou was heavy with expectation. By the time the vote was called, the outcome was already known. Every member of the transitional parliament raised a hand. Not a single abstention, not a single protest. The unanimity itself became the headline. A rare sight in a world where politics usually fractures along fault lines. This was the climax of a shift that had been building not just for months, but for decades. Burkina Faso had gone from silence to criminalization in less than 2 years. The moment was not framed as a technical amendment to the family code, but as a collective affirmation. The law, they said, was not about importing morality, but about safeguarding society. Justice Minister Edaso Rodrigue Baya's defense captured the mood. Calling homosexuality bizarre behavior, he framed the new ban not as an innovation, but as a recognition of what 90% of Burkinabe citizens already believed. In churches on Sundays, in mosques on Fridays, and in family meetings across the countryside, his words echoed what many were already saying. To his supporters, the parliament had not invented new morality. It had given legal voice to the conscience of the people. But while applause echoed in Ouagadougou, outrage rang out abroad. Human rights organizations issued statements within hours. Western newspapers splashed headlines about intolerance and regression. Analysts in Washington, London, and Brussels warned of aid cuts and sanctions. Comparisons were made instantly. Uganda's anti-LGBT law, Ghana's pending legislation, Nigeria's strict enforcement. Burkina Faso, once a quiet outlier, had joined the club. Inside Africa, however, the reaction was far more complex. In Mali, still ruled by its own junta, the news was welcomed as a step toward moral clarity. In Niger, struggling with both insurgency and sanctions, the move was interpreted as part of a shared Sahelian awakening. Leaders saw in Traoré's defiance an echo of their own struggles against foreign pressure. Across the continent, conservative voices praised the law as proof that Africa could chart its own path without waiting for permission. The intensity of the moment was heightened by the figure of Captain Ibrahim Traoré himself. At just his early 30s, he embodied a generational shift. A young officer who had seized power in 2022 and who presented himself as the face of resistance against colonial legacy. His rise had already unsettled Paris, especially after he expelled French troops and pivoted Burkina Faso toward alliances with Mali and Niger. Now, with the passage of this law, he was binding cultural sovereignty to political independence. For supporters, this alignment was electrifying. It gave the sense that Burkina Faso was not merely reacting to outside pressure, but actively shaping its own destiny. For critics, however, it was dangerous theater, a distraction from insurgencies in the north, economic hardship, and failing infrastructure. Some argued that moral legislation was being used to rally popular support and divert attention from problems that could not be solved with a signature on a legal code. Still, the symbolism proved powerful. The unanimous vote was replayed on local television, shared across WhatsApp groups, and discussed in community meetings. To many, it was a sign that the state was finally speaking with the same voice as the people. Meanwhile, international institutions prepared their responses. The United Nations raised concerns. The World Bank hinted at reviewing its partnerships. Western embassies issued cautious statements. None of them could ignore the fact that Burkina Faso, a country struggling with jihadist violence and economic fragility, had chosen a path that risked further isolation. Yet for Traoré and his allies, this was the point. They wanted the world to see that Burkina Faso was no longer afraid of disapproval. The law was not simply about criminalizing a private act. It was about sending a message. Africa will not be lectured into submission. The drama of September 2025 was therefore not just a legal milestone. It was a stage upon which two narratives collided. On one side, the global discourse of rights and freedoms. On the other, the local discourse of faith, identity, and sovereignty. But beyond applause and condemnation, the question remained, what would be the cost of this defiance, and who would pay the price? The vote was over, but the consequences were only beginning. In Ouagadougou, the immediate reaction was celebration among supporters. In villages, elders nodded in approval, seeing the law as an affirmation of community values. In churches and mosques, preachers praised Parliament for aligning the state with faith. For many Burkinabe, the decision felt less like the start of something new and more like the confirmation of what had always been known. Yet this consensus carried a dual edge. Domestically, the government appeared stronger. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, facing constant questions about legitimacy after seizing power in 2022, now stood at the helm of a state that had spoken with one voice. The unanimous vote gave his administration an aura of unity rarely seen in transitional governments. In a land fractured by insurgencies and political upheaval, the symbolism of unanimity mattered. It was an image of stability projected at a time of turmoil. But beneath that image lay deeper risks. Burkina Faso is a nation already scarred by conflict. Islamist insurgents hold sway across large stretches of the Sahel, displacing thousands and overwhelming the army. The economy struggles under the weight of insecurity, with markets disrupted and farms abandoned. In such a fragile environment, the law against homosexuality may serve as a rallying cry for unity, but it cannot put food on tables or keep villages safe from gunfire. For ordinary citizens, the most immediate effect may not be imprisonment or prosecution, but the shifting tone of society. Silence has been replaced by state sanction. What was once a private condemnation whispered in homes has now become public condemnation backed by the courts. In practice, this risks deepening social exclusion, fueling discrimination, and giving space for scapegoating. For individuals who already lived in fear, the law becomes a sword hanging over daily life. Internationally, the stakes are even higher. Burkina Faso relies on external support, not only in aid, but in loans, investment, and security partnerships. Already whispers of sanctions circulate. Rights groups are lobbying international donors. The European Union has suspended projects in other African nations over similar laws. The United States has threatened to restrict visas and funding in cases like Uganda. For a country with fragile finances, the threat of economic isolation is real. Yet this is precisely where the government frames the law as part of a bigger project. To Traoré and his circle, this is not only about morality, but about sovereignty. They present the legislation as a line drawn against colonial legacies and Western interference. In their eyes, the law is a shield, a way of saying that decisions in Ouagadougou are not dictated in Paris, Washington, or Brussels. This posture resonates strongly within the wider Sahel. Across Mali and Niger, populations facing sanctions after military coups have embraced narratives of independence. For many citizens in the region, sovereignty is no longer a diplomatic slogan. It is a survival strategy. To be free from colonial tutelage is to reclaim dignity. And in this sense, Burkina Faso's law is framed not only as a domestic measure, but as part of a broader movement, Anti-Colonial Africa. Still, the gamble is dangerous. If sanctions deepen poverty, if aid is cut and loans withheld, it is ordinary citizens who will bear the cost. Farmers, traders, and students will feel the pressure long before politicians do. The risk is that a law passed in the name of dignity may end up worsening hardship for those who already struggle to survive. And yet the government calculates differently. It believes that alliances with Mali, Niger, Russia, and China can offset the losses. It believes that the pride of sovereignty can sustain popular support even when the economy suffers. Whether this calculation is wise remains uncertain. The truth is that Burkina Faso's parliament has set the country on a path where law and politics intertwine. The measure was never only about sexuality. It was about who decides the shape of society and who has the authority to enforce it. At home, that authority has been asserted with unanimity. Abroad, the challenge has only begun, because the world was watching, and the next move would not come from Ouagadougou alone. It would come from its corridors of power in Washington, Brussels, and beyond. The news from Ouagadougou did not stay in Ouagadougou. Within hours of the unanimous vote, the reactions arrived from across the globe. In New York, the United Nations issued concern, reminding member states of international conventions on human rights. In Brussels, the European Union warned that financial partnerships could be re-evaluated. Washington released a statement stressing that aid would not be unconditional. Western capitals framed the law as a violation of basic freedoms, echoing a familiar chorus: rights are universal, and nations that depart from them must expect consequences. But in Bamako and Niamey, the tone was different. Leaders in Mali and Niger, both under military juntas and facing sanctions of their own, welcomed Burkina Faso's decision as an act of courage. They framed it as part of a Sahelian awakening, a refusal to be dictated to by the same powers that once colonized the region. Moscow praised Ouagadougou's sovereign choice, while Beijing, more cautious, pointed to the principle of non-interference. Together, these alliances created the outline of a new axis: Sahelian states resisting Western leverage, backed by non-Western partners. International organizations were caught in the middle. The African Union expressed concern but avoided direct condemnation, reflecting its own divisions. ECOWAS, already strained by multiple coups among its members, remained cautious, wary of deepening rifts with the Sahel bloc. Civil society organizations, especially rights groups in Europe and North America, amplified calls for sanctions. At the same time, conservative voices within Africa insisted that the law was an expression of cultural sovereignty that deserved respect. The contrast was stark. To the west, Burkina Faso's decision was a step backward, a defiance of global norms. To its allies and neighbors, it was a step forward, a reassertion of independence. The same event became two different stories, one about repression, the other about self-determination. This duality is precisely why the law resonates beyond its borders. It is not simply about the rights of individuals in Burkina Faso. It is about the clash between two worldviews, one rooted in liberal universalism, the other in collective tradition and local authority. And in the middle stands a small Sahelian state declaring its right to choose. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his allies, the point is clear. Burkina Faso will not be judged by criteria it did not write. It will not remain silent. It will speak in its own voice, even if that voice provokes anger abroad. This is the heart of African sovereignty. The claim that decisions made in Ouagadougou carry the same weight as those made in Paris, London, or Washington. But if sovereignty is declared with words, it must be defended with deeds, and the hardest tests were still to come. The law has been passed, the statements have been made, and the dust has settled in Ouagadougou. But what lies ahead for Burkina Faso and for Africa more broadly? The first challenge is economic. International partners are already signaling possible sanctions, reductions in aid, or freezes in loans. For a country grappling with poverty and conflict, these measures could strike hard. Farmers already face disrupted harvests due to insecurity, while families struggle with rising food prices. Any cut in financial flows from abroad will deepen hardship. The government's bet is that new alliances with Mali, Niger, Russia, and China can soften the blow. Whether these ties can fill the gap left by Western donors remains uncertain. The second challenge is security. Burkina Faso sits at the epicenter of the Sahel crisis, battling insurgents who thrive on instability. A law about morality will not stop bullets or reclaim territory. Yet by rallying society around sovereignty, the government hopes to consolidate support, turning cultural defiance into political legitimacy. In this sense, the law becomes not just legal text, but a weapon of morale, a reminder that the nation must stand together. The third challenge is generational. Captain Ibrahim Traoré embodies a new wave of African leaders, young, defiant, unapologetic. To some, he is a hero of independence. To others, a populist risking isolation. The future will test whether his vision of sovereignty can be matched by tangible progress in governance, education, and economic reform. If the promise of dignity does not translate into better lives, enthusiasm may fade into disillusion. Still, opportunity hides within risk. By rejecting the script written abroad, Burkina Faso has the chance to write its own. It can redefine partnerships, strengthen regional bonds, and carve a path that reflects its values rather than imposed templates. The image of a seed planted in Sahelian soil returns here. Fragile, threatened by storms, yet holding within it the power of transformation. The question now is whether that seed will grow into a tree of resilience or wither under pressure. For Africa, the answer matters beyond Burkina Faso. The decision of one landlocked nation resonates across borders, inspiring some, unsettling others. And so the story does not end here. It stands on a cliff, facing the winds of the future, daring to ask, can sovereignty survive the storm? And can dignity be sustained in a world that demands conformity? In the end, the story of Burkina Faso's new law is not only about sexuality. It is about the deeper struggle of a continent determined to decide for itself. For more than 6 decades, Burkina Faso lived in silence, a silence that neither condemned nor protected. With a single unanimous vote, that silence was broken. The message was not whispered. It was declared, sovereignty belongs to those who claim it. To the West, the decision is troubling, a retreat from universal rights. To many Africans, it is a triumph, a restoration of cultural order, a statement that laws must reflect the values of the people, not the prescriptions of distant powers. The collision between these two worldviews is not new, but it has rarely been expressed with such clarity. This moment belongs to Anti-Colonial Africa, a generation that refuses to be judged solely by standards written in Paris, Washington, or Brussels. It belongs to leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, who see in sovereignty not just a diplomatic phrase, but a weapon of survival and a banner of pride. It belongs to communities across the Sahel, who, despite insecurity and hardship, cling to dignity as their last defense. The question now is whether this act of defiance can be sustained. Can Burkina Faso and its allies turn cultural assertion into political stability, into economic growth, into lasting independence? Or will sanctions, poverty, and insecurity erode the very sovereignty they seek to protect? What is clear is that Africa is no longer silent. It no longer wishes to be the student at the back of the classroom, nodding at lessons imposed by others. It seeks to stand as an equal, even if its answers are uncomfortable. This is the essence of African sovereignty. So we leave you with this question. If one small nation in the Sahel can speak with its own voice, what might happen when the entire continent does the same? If this story moved you, do not let it fade into silence. Share your thoughts below. Subscribe to our channel and walk with us as we follow the unfolding journey of a continent reclaiming its destiny.